Hey guys, in this video I'm going to go over Game 2 of the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and challenger Carlsen-Karjakin. And in the first game of the match, we saw Carlsen bring a surprise in his white game by playing the Trumpowski, and Karjakin effectively held the position. And now is Karjakin's turn to get the white pieces and sort of spring preparation, or just make black a little bit uncomfortable, but make Carlsen uncomfortable in the opening. Sort of like in tennis, it's like having the opportunity of having the first serve. And yeah, it's always interesting to see what the first move will be. In Karjakin's seconds, or I know at least one of them, Mamad Yarov, is almost exclusively a d4 player, or d4 knight f3 type of player. And so I actually do expect Karjakin to bring out some d4 during the match. But today he played e4, which has been his trusty weapon for his entire life, really. Now, this may be a red herring. I like to actually call some of the openings in the first few games of the match red herring openings, because many times you see an opening or a setup used once or twice, sort of like Carlsen did with the Trumpowski maybe, and never used again, just to sort of throw your opponent for a spin and make the seconds that do a lot of the analysis during the match have a few sleepless nights, thinking about, oh man, what's going to happen if they do this again? How are we going to respond? And so e4 may be the move he plays today, but may not be the move he plays most of the event. So we'll see whether if Karjakin decides to continue to attack this way in the future. Carlsen responded with e5. That's his most popular, trusty weapon. And after knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, we get Ruy Lopez, most classical opening in chess with a very, very long history, which goes centuries back. So bishop e5, a6, and this is a slight surprise because Carlsen's main weapon in this variation, the Ruy Lopez variation, is the Berlin. And the Berlin is sort of a welcome, isn't always a welcome opening for many chess fans, because it's very drawish, and more than that, it's just very solid and not so dynamic. But a lot of times, white players have been banging their head against the wall in the main line, which goes after castles, knight takes e4, d4, knight d6, bishop takes e6, d takes e6, d takes e5, knight f5, takes. And this endgame, though on the face of it, looks like white should be a great deal better because of the safer king, or at least a castled king, better pawn structure, and maybe even slightly more development, actually turns out to be a surprisingly difficult nut to crack. And that's why it's actually called the Berlin Wall. So many players are very frustrated by this and go make moves like d3 just to avoid the Berlin endgame that arises in that last line I showed. But Carlsen goes for a6 today, which is the most popular move. And Karjakin goes bishop a4, which is standard. I just want to point out for players that maybe haven't played too long, bishop takes c6, d takes e6, knight takes e5 is not actually winning a pawn because of queen d4, which hits the e4 and e4 pawn and the e5 knight. You can't defend both, so the e4 pawn drops. So after bishop a4, knight f6, standard. Again, the e5 pawn is not hanging because of the trick with queen d4 I just showed. And castles is played, and now the pawn is actually being threatened. So, but here bishop e7 covers that, because now if white does give the bishop up with bishop takes c6, d takes, and then knight takes e5, knight takes e4 is quite frankly good enough, and you just recover the pawn, and black has the two bishops in a very good position. So because of those dynamics, white usually does something else. Rook e1 is the most popular move, but d3, rook e1 just to show, is the most popular move, but d3 has been the latest trend in the past few years. And the point is just to sort of get protect the pawn and get a playable position that maybe is not as popular as some of the other lines. Although d3 has been played so much that it's actually becoming one of those popular lines. It does have this main threat of actually attacking e5 right away now, because now if bishop takes c6, d takes e6, and knight takes e5, the pawn on e5 would just be free, and the e4 pawn is protected, so there's no double attack on the knight and the pawn anymore. So d3, b5, standard, bishop b3, and now d6 just to overprotect the e5 pawn. And now a3, and this is a move which has a relatively short history. It was played the first, I don't know if it was the first time it was played, but I can remember a very, very famous game now a few years ago between Fabiano Caruana and Levon Aronian, where a3 was played, and it was a very nice game for Fabiano with the white pieces. And essentially, you just keep the bishop on this long diagonal, because in this position before a3, knight a5 was a real threat. So just securing the two bishops, because the bishop would have no square on the diagonal where it couldn't be taken after knight a5. So a3 basically secures against that. Now castles comes. It's always a good idea to castle the king. And now knight c3. And now you see the other idea of keeping the bishop on the diagonal is now white aims to sort of control the d5 square. So with knight c3 and bishop e3 and the pawn e4, you do an effective job of controlling the light squares for the time being. Black played knight a5 here, although I also want to point out that bishop g4 is fully playable. Typically after bishop g4, knight d4 is a real threat, hitting the bishop on b3 and walking into this really nagging pin. And typically your bishop e3 is the move sort of covering against that pin. And you can imagine something like knight d4, and I don't know, maybe bishop takes d4, e takes d4, and then play sort of coming along these lines. But instead of bishop g4, Carlsen went for knight a5, which also has a very reasonable recommendation. So bishop a2, and now bishop e6. And this is sort of the key move. In many of these lines where black delays playing pawn d4 and keeps the pawn on d3, the move bishop e6 is very effective because there's no pressure on black center yet, and it's very important to sort of get rid of this light squared bishop that white has on the long diagonal, because it's very, very menacing and effective piece. Now you might say, why not bishop takes e6, f takes e6? Well, this actually has been played in that game I was mentioning before. Bishop takes e6 was played by Caruana, and then actually b4 was played. And then after knight, I think b7 was played, the knight was actually shut out of the game for a little bit, and white actually went on to win a nice game. But the theory has developed since then, and I've actually always preferred the black side of these positions, simply because these double pawns on e5 and e6 aren't really weaknesses. The reason I say that is because the e pawn the e6 pawn and the e5 pawn, do a really good effective job of covering the hopping squares in the center of the board for the knights. The e6 pawn does a great job of controlling that all-important d5 square, and the e5 pawn does a good job of controlling the d4 square. So it's not, double pawns here aren't as bad as they look. And I just want to point out also, the rook has a half-open file, f-file, that's sort of valuable potential asset for maneuvering and for just doubling the rooks later. So bishop takes e6 is not something black necessarily fears, and white decided to go his own way by playing d4. And I think this has some merit to it. Now that the knight is a little bit off sides, and it's not protecting the e5 pawn, it does make some sense to put some pressure on it. But because white didn't actually trade the bishops and give those double pawns, black can now take on a2 and spoil white's coordination a little bit. So Carlsen took on a2, bishop takes a2, and then you can't take with the knight on a2 because knight takes e4. If you look here, this pawn would be hanging, and the knight would be a little bit wayward on a2. And so rook takes a2 is played. And in this position, the rook is offsides on a2, but white does have a good control over the center. Does have a little bit more space. And here's probably the first new move or original move you could say, and it's rook e8. It's not such a surprising move because it actually is the recommendation of the engines, I believe. But it's maybe a surprising move to the average player because it's like, why are you just giving up e5? Why isn't it defended? And well, the point is that it's actually indirectly defended because after d takes e5, d takes e5, knight takes e5, there's always this move bishop d6, which attacks the e5 knight and uncovers the rook on e8. And as a consequence of that, the e4 pawn is actually lost. Or if you defend it, then then black recovers the pawn after bishop takes e5. And so, because of this bishop d6 resource, the pawn is actually inadvertently defended. And I actually should point out that in this position with bishop d6, now this rook on a2 looks really stupid, and the bishop is still on c1. And so, after black recovers that pawn, black would also have more coordination too. So those are things that sort of justify the rook e8 move. So after rook e8, rook a1 was played, and I thought that was a very, very clever move. I was actually on site for round 2 of the championship yesterday, and I was telling people around me rook a1 is really clever because essentially you're going to have to move the rook back to a1 anyway, and it's an effective way of passing to black. So it's like, it's sort of asking black, what are you going to do next? I see that I can't take your pawn, but I have the center, and I'm just going to keep the tension and sort of, ask you a question. And that's something that you really, really, as chess players, it's very effective to do that sometimes when you're playing, to sort of pose the question, what are you going to do next? So now they actually engage, because neither side really wants to clarify the position in the center. I mean, after e takes d4, the knight could come to d4 and potentially go to f5. So that's not something that black wants to allow. But also, white doesn't want to actually clarify the position either, because after d takes c5, it becomes a relatively dry position and symmetrical. So because of that, black makes another waiting move, knight c4. And I should say, this is a little bit more than just a waiting move. I mean, it does effectively cover the e5 pawn, but it also sort of relocates the knight to a better square than it was on a5, and it also hits the b2 pawn. So now black might have been thinking about playing bishop g5 or making some sort of move like that. And now that's sort of out of the question because the b2 pawn is hanging. So clever move by Magnus, and I have to say, during the broadcast, for some reason I hadn't looked at this, but it's pretty obvious to me now that it has to be played. So rook e1, another effective waiting move, getting the rook to the file and protecting the e4 pawn again. Overprotection is important sometimes. And now rook c8, another important waiting move. And the point is that you think about playing c5. That might be an option at some point. And so you put the rook there just to sort of hint at the idea. And also, if white ever plays d5, which is sometimes an idea in these positions, black is ready to play c6 and break at the center. And you can imagine after like d takes c6, queen c7, or even rook takes c6, sorry, there's good pressure on the c file, which compensates the backward d pawn. So just a clever waiting move, rook c8. So now after rook c8, white goes h3. And again, you sort of see the waiting moves being exchanged. Karjakin doesn't want to budge, and neither does Carlsen, so they're both playing these waiting moves. And you might be able to guess the next waiting move that Carlsen plays after Karjakin plays h3, and it's h6. Again, a very useful move, covering the g5 square, giving a luff to the king, giving some air to the king. And again, saying to black, saying to white, what are you going to do? So now white sort of decides to budge, and probably ran out of most of the useful waiting moves, and plays b3. And the point is now the knight has to move back to b6. Keep in mind the knight did not make this tour to c4 to go back to a5. It's going back to b6, a little bit closer to the action. And now bishop b2, getting that bishop on the diagonal. And again, black doesn't really want to play e takes d4 because now you can entertain maybe this bishop on b2 having some real influence on the long diagonal after like knight takes d4, and maybe like queen f3 and knight f5. Then there'd be some pressure. So Carlsen doesn't want to actually exchange, and instead he plays bishop f8. Always a useful move in Ruy Lopez structures. Rook e8, bishop f8 is like a classic maneuver. Uncut, protects the pawn now, and just as a good bishop on f8 is just a good place for it. And now the pawn is protected, and black doesn't really have any problems. So really good opening choice by Magnus Carlsen so far, just to sort of neutralize white's pressure. So d takes e5, and this is sort of a sign that, you know, Karjakin didn't really see anything better to go for. It's tough to actually suggest another way to push forward. I actually think the mistake here for Karjakin was actually even putting this bishop on b2. I don't really like it there, to be honest. I think it's just biting on granite on this e5 pawn. And so I really thought it should have been served better on the c1, g5 diagonal. Other moves, maybe like sort of like a4, something like that, would be ill-advised, because if you play a4, b4 would come, and the knight doesn't have a real good square to go to with that, where it doesn't lose its coordination. Another idea maybe could have been like to sort of connect the rooks by playing like queen d2 or queen d3, and then rook a d1. But again, I have a hard time believing anything would be so bad for black after a move like c5. Just sort of putting the challenge to black to clarify the position in the center. So I think black is more or less fine. So, but after d takes e5, the position is relatively symmetrical, and it's hard to imagine white can have anything here, particularly with this bishop on b2, which is not really doing that much. So, a4 is played first, attacking the b4 pawn, and then c6, just defending it, or the b5 pawn, then c6, just defending it again, over protecting it. And now we have more trades. Queen takes d8, rook takes d8, a takes e5, a takes e5. And again, there's just not much to do in this really symmetrical position. The only problem piece in black's position is this knight on b6. It's not really in the game still, because the b3 pawn dominates it on c4 and a4, and it can't go to d5. So the only problem is this knight on b6. But I would say this poor knight on b6 is compensated by this sort of not so great knight on c3 and this bishop on b2, which isn't so great either, because the bishop doesn't really have much scope, and the knight on c3 really doesn't have scope. So yeah, not much here. So knight e2 was played, I guess trying to relocate the knight somewhere else, and also attacking the e5 pawn. That's the most important thing. And after a move like knight takes e4, which Carlsen did not play, black could then take bishop takes e5, and there'd be a trading of pawns and more liquidation, really. But actually, in this position, yeah, it's just there isn't so much going on here. Now, Carlsen instead decided to play bishop b4, which I think is a very useful move, sort of attacking the e1 rook and maybe moving it away from indirect defense of the e4 pawn. And Karjakin played bishop c3. And already here, this game has been a little bit more of a snooze fest than the first, because the pieces are coming off and there isn't any life really here. So you just see some more trades. Bishop takes e3, knight takes e3, knight bd7, another move, just sort of moving the knight more towards the center, and maybe sort of maybe thinking about going to c5, but just overprotection, symmetrical position. I mean, if you look at the position from the e file onward, it's actually completely symmetrical. So white does have the a file here, which is a small symbolic advantage because having open files for your rooks are always valuable. So Karjakin goes rook a6, taking advantage of the open a file. But after rook c8, that's all it is, symbolic, because there's no additional way to increase the pressure on the c6 pawn. If you move the knight to a2 to think about knight b4, then knight c5, I'll just show that, knight a2, knight c5, just hits the rook and the e4 pawn. So you're just not in time to generate any real threats. So after rook c8, white went b4, sort of stopping knight c5. But again, not much going on here. Now, there was something that was talked about a little bit after the game here. Carlsen played rook e6, which is perfectly reasonable. There was chatter about this c5 move, I think. Wasn't it c5? Yeah, it was c5. And the idea was that after you're hitting this the b4 pawn, and a trade taking here wouldn't be such a good idea because rook takes c5, hitting the knight and the pawn behind it. So that line was knight takes b5, c takes b4, and knight d6. And then here it looks like white is forking both the rook on c8 and the rook on e8, and it's tough to see what to do. But actually, rook e6 is a very resourceful move, pinning the knight and threatening to capture this pawn on c2. And then after knight takes c8, rook takes c8, rook takes a6. If anyone's better, it's black, because this knight on c8 is really sort of a wayward knight, a little bit uncoordinated. And the c2 pawn is a little bit weaker than the b4 pawn. So part of the reason that's the case is because the c2 pawn is like not advanced at all, and the b4 pawn is far advanced. And you can easily imagine if the c2 pawn is somehow lost with a move like rook c6, that b4 pawn can be a real asset. Also, it's actually much harder to defend e4 here than it is e5, because the rook is actually tending to it, and if it moves, then e4 hangs. So black would have a symbolic advantage here, but white would probably defend just fine. Now, Carlsen did not play c5. He played rook e6 with the idea to play c5, but it's sort of one move too late in terms of trying to get something going there. And Karjakin just plays rook b1, protecting b4, and yeah, just sort of shoring up the queen side a little bit. And after c5, we get more exchanges. Rook takes e6, f takes e6, knight takes b5, c takes e4, rook takes e4, rook takes e2. And I just want to point out here, like we said earlier in the game, these double pawns, although we usually say double pawns are not great, these ones aren't so bad because they control valuable squares in the center. And black is active enough that white doesn't really have the time to attack them. So here we saw knight d6, and protecting the e4 pawn, covering the f7 square so the king can't go to f7. And it's also a little bit of a draw because now it allows Carlsen to force a repetition after rook c1 check, king h2, rook c2 attacking the f2 pawn, and then king g1 back protecting. King g3 didn't make so much sense to be played here because of knight h5, and then you might get into a bit of hot water actually because the king would have to go up the board. So after rook c2, we just saw king g1 again, and then they agreed to a draw here in a position where it's a repetition. I believe there's Sophia rules, so I believe they can't have draws before move 30, but it's right after move 30. The position is totally dead, and yeah, not much to play for here. So yeah, this game was a bit of a snooze fest as far as exciting games are concerned, but I think Karjakin did have an advantage a little bit of an advantage in the opening, and maybe could have pressed it a bit better than he did. I did not like white putting the bishop on b2. Like I said, it was sort of biting on granite on that diagonal. I think I would have liked to see it on the c1 to g5 diagonal, whether it would have gone to e3 or g5. Would have liked to see that. And as usual, Carlsen really plays the Ruy Lopez well, so you have to be really sharp if you're going to get anything at all. And so I think Carlsen is going to be sort of reasonably pleased with this game, and Gonna really take it to Karjakin in Game 3, which is tomorrow on Monday. So thanks for tuning in, and I'm gonna bring round-to-round coverage soon. So stay tuned. Have a good one.